This is the Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell, on Alternative Talk, AM 1150. Now, back to the show with local mortgage and finance expert, Tina Mitchell.
Welcome back to the Money Hour with your host and mortgage expert, Tina Mitchell, right here on 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, November 28th show. It is a great day to talk about money, and that's why I'm here with you and what the show is all about, how to make money, save money, and build a better quality of life for you and your family. If you're hearing my show at a different time or day, you are listening to a rebroadcast, but you can talk with any of the guests I have in studio by calling the show at 1-855-400-1150. Again, that's 1-855-400-1150 or online at themoneyhour.com. And in studio right now, I have Harley Furen with RE/MAX Junction, and we're talking today about property management. Holly, thank you for coming in and joining me in studio.
Thank you for having me.
And a little bit about Holly. Holly is with RE/MAX Junction, is a third generation of real estate broker and property manager in Seattle. She has over 20 years of personal experience as property manager. She helps her clients acquire investment properties as well as find tenants for them and manage their real estate properties. She appreciates the relationships that she develops with her clients. Holly is heavily involved in the community service and as well as being a Girl Scout troop leader. Exciting because I sold Girl Scout cookies growing up, Holly, so we've got something in common. And my mom was a troop leader.
Oh, nice.
So, Holly, let's go ahead and start out with what should my listeners be aware of when managing their own property?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that people need to be aware of is the laws. The laws are constantly changing. They're constantly adding new laws, and laws can be different between incorporated Seattle and unincorporated Seattle and beyond. So the newest law that's been rolling out over this year and many deadlines have passed is the Rental Registration and Inspection Ordinance.
Okay.
They haven't really promoted it a lot, so I've come across a lot of property owners that are just clueless that it's even in existence, and they try to find ways to avoid registering their rental property. And also, certain Seattle laws require you to change your locks between tenants. Also, having written screening requirements that you hand people when you are giving them an application for tenancy.
Okay.
So those are just Seattle ordinances or Seattle requirements, but not necessarily beyond Seattle. Another new one that came up over the last few years is carbon monoxide detectors, and that's for both rentals and homes in general. You should have a carbon monoxide detector on every floor that has bedrooms, and a lot of people don't understand that law, so they'll end up putting either too many or in the wrong location or none.
Which we have to deal that on the financing side as well. But I would imagine if you make any of these issues and something happens, it's a pretty big deal.
Huge liability.
So let's talk about what the risks are for rental owners who self-manage.
Sure. I think one of the biggest things that people tend to not think about is setting aside some of that income for a fund. So when expenses come up, they are able to afford those expenses. I had a rental property where there was a plumbing issue and it turned into a plumbing nightmare. And it ended up costing the owner $30,000. And
oh my gosh.
He did not have a fund. So he had to take out more money against the house.
Which fortunately he had the equity to do that, because a lot of times you may not have the equity,
correct.
Especially if you're looking at doing it for an investment property versus a primary residence.
And also when you have a new property, it takes time to build that equity and that income. But investments over time will accumulate those things to compensate for those issues.
So what about the kind of lease that should be used, Holly?
I think that having an extensively written lease with the timeline is what I prefer when I'm managing my properties. Having a verbal lease is obviously not legally binding. And a month-to-month lease can really cause a lot of gray area, especially when you're moving to sell that property or if you need to evict a tenant. That can really become a problem when you have to present that in front of a judge, and there's a lot of gray area with what was the lease.
Sure.
And a lot of people will download a lease from the internet and use that, and that's typically fine, but it's also usually not extensive. So that can also be a problem.
You never know if the ones that you're downloading are up to date. And if you are doing that, you definitely want to make sure that it's the right area, as you said, because there's all these different laws depending on where the property is located. So what's an example of having the right documents? Or I should say of not having the right documents.
I mean, some leases will have the lead-based paint included in it. And if it's not, that should be an addendum to the lease. Because if it's a house they always say 1978 or before, I like to say 1980 because you have to consider some of that paint was on a shelf for a few years after that. So anything past 1980 should really have a lead-based paint addendum with it. That's a huge one, because if people don't get a lead-based paint pamphlet or a lead-based paint addendum and they weren't aware of lead-based paint dangers, that's a huge risk.
Okay, so they're setting themselves up for a possible lawsuit.
Yeah.
Okay. And for the homeowner and being able to protect themselves, what is your advice there?
So the best way to protect yourself with your rental properties is to have them secured under a limited liability corporation. That way you're securing those assets from becoming a liability to you if there is a lawsuit. Because anything that's not protected and it's just your asset becomes something that somebody could take away from you. And if you have several investment properties, that's all something that could become a asset that they can
So make sure you're getting it protected under an LLC. So a lot of people that are thinking of property management, because there is a cost for that, which we'll talk about. But when you look at the marketing and what you're able to do for that property, can you talk about what type of marketing that there is that's included in hiring a property management company to manage those rental properties?
Most people use online and either internet or newspaper ads, or they'll put a sign in front of a house. But agents have the benefit of marketing the properties through the Northwest Multiple Listing Service, which allows other agents to have visibility and show that property when the agent
and when you're not using a property
available.
Management company, you don't have that.
You don't have that.
Which is huge, just like when you're purchasing a home.
Correct.
Okay.
And you also have a bigger network. When an agent is bringing a client to see your home, they're already a first reference.
Yes.
So you know you're getting a quality renter, because an agent's not going to, well, I would hope that they wouldn't bring somebody that would be
not
an
be
issue
a good,
later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, with everything that rents are doing, which we'll talk about as well, but while we're on this topic, just like a seller may think, well, right now I can sell my home. Why wouldn't I why should I use a real estate agent to pay that 3% commission when there's all these buyers out here? And I always say that the question is, do you want to get top dollar? Because it takes experience to get top dollar. It also takes experience to bring in multiple offers. Now, are you seeing in the rental market that there are still multiple offers going on, or multiple people that are coming in to rent that same property, which is bringing that rent up?
Yeah, the boom in the population in Seattle just in the last year has really pushed the market both in sales and rentals up, and of course everybody doesn't like that. And a lot of people who've come from out of the area, they're very shocked when they hear there's things like price wars on a rental.
Yes, isn't that
very
crazy?
Real thing.
Yeah, and I've heard that some people have actually put in, just going in with a higher price, just like you're bidding up a home, doing the same on in the rental market.
Yeah, it's a little trickier because with a sale, there's paperwork and a paper trail.
Okay.
Whereas a rental price war, it's more of a verbal thing between the landlord and the applicants.
Okay.
So some applicants can start to feel like, well, is this really a way to get more money out of me and not a real price war?
Yeah, versus with, just like you said, with the contracts, they've got to be able to show those other offers. So what about price? How do you determine that, Holly?
Yeah, the benefit of being an agent is I have the ability to go on the Northwest Multiple Listing Service and see what things actually rented for.
Okay.
When people are looking to price their own property, they will often go to a place like Craigslist or Zillow, and unfortunately, that's a little misleading because people either putting their properties on for top dollar, so it might not have rented for that price.
Sure.
There's also a lot of scams bringing prices down. So when you're looking at a very low price, it's very possible that somebody stole the photos and the information and put a scam ad. And I'd say about a third of the ads that are online are potentially not a legitimate ad.
Really? I had no idea. So it's the same again as, using this in comparison to pricing a home and really having the data to make sure that you're pricing right, and you want to price right the first time.
Right.
For that. So you're providing those stats and data for the actual owner of the property to strategize on how they want to price it for lease.
Sure. And time of year can also be a factor when pricing. So the price of your home isn't consistent throughout the year. It's depending on time of year and what the market's doing.
Makes total sense. So what advice do you have for tenant relations?
I see a lot of owners managing from the heart. So I'd say don't manage with your heart, manage with your head. Real estate is definitely a relationship business, so people who aren't very good with relationships might want to hire somebody who is, because there could be things like neighbor disputes. You could have a tenant that's causing some waves with your neighbor that you have a good relationship with, but then there could be a lot of risk for potential property damage because somebody's angry and your house is going to fall victim to that.
Yep.
So navigating through just those relations. And also, I find that tenants will try to push the envelope a little bit if they feel like a precedence has been set by the landlord if they were late for rent.
Okay.
And if they feel like they can push that a little bit, they'll continue to develop a pattern and yeah.
Yeah, and you thought if you do have a more personal relationship when you're owning the property versus if it's actual and a business that you're doing. And I've noticed too, a lot of times when people don't hire a property management company because of the expense, they're actually renting the property out less than what they should be renting it out because this is not what their business. They're not paying attention or they have that emotional connection that you're talking about, and they're not increasing the rents like they should be, ultimately coming out further behind than they would have if they hire a property management company. So really just having that that knowledge and the from a business side versus the emotional side that you were talking about.
Yeah. Hiring somebody takes that relationship out.
Exactly.
Of the equation.
Yep. So what about the benefit of having a property manager over managing your own rental properties? What would be another benefit that you would share?
Sure. A good manager should be keeping the costs low for the owners. They should have exceptional screening skills, be able to negotiate a contract, and keep everyone happy while doing all of those things. And the biggest benefit of having a property manager manage for you is taking the liability out of the equation, because agents are typically insured against liabilities. So if a tenant is upset with something going on and they present a lawsuit, so they're probably going to include maybe the owner and maybe the agent or just the agent, whoever they're upset with, of course. But the agent is insured to have those court costs absorbed if for some reason they lose. So the potential for the asset becoming something, unless of course everybody is not doing it properly, then you just take that whole thing becomes something that is not going to be on the owner, and then have them lose their property.
Got it. Okay. So Holly, what do you think about rents and where they might be going? What does your crystal ball say for our future?
Yeah. In the Seattle area, because there's so much new construction, I do believe that the rates are going to start to come down a little bit.
Okay.
Definitely not in the places where people would like them to be overall. Gone are the days of the $1,000 one-bedroom apartment in downtown Seattle. It's just not something that you can easily come by.
And what would you expect for a one-bedroom property in downtown Seattle?
Depending on things like if there's parking, if there's all of the appliances, then it could be anywhere from $1,700 to maybe $1,900. If it's beyond
Wow.
that, it's usually because there's maybe a view
Sure.
or something.
Amenities, or if they're living in a condo or something.
Right.
Yeah. For making sure that the tenants are screened, and what is the process? Because that's another benefit of having a management company, is just making sure that they're choosing, because it's not always about money, but it's about how that tenant is going to perform, because
Correct.
ultimately that ends up being a better financial decision. So what are you doing there in assisting in that arena?
Yeah. When I'm calling references, that gives me a clue as to how the person's going to be living there. If they've owned their own home before, chances are they're going to take care of the rental home a little bit better, because they know certain things like check under the sink and see if anything's leaking. Or, look at the outside and make sure the gutters are clean, things like that. Also, when I am calling references, I look for things that people say, things like they're responsible, they're very well maintained, or they maintain their house very well. If I hear things like they're really nice, they're so funny, that's probably not going to tell me how they live. It
Okay.
just tells me they're nice and funny.
Yeah. What about their financial ability to repay Holly?
Sure.
What kind of process do you guys go through for that?
I think most owners and managers look for people who are making at least 3 times the rent, because that gives them
Okay.
the ability to cover that and then have extra funds later. Some management companies say the whole house, or one person has to make that, or the whole household. And so each management company has a little bit of a different policy on that.
Okay. But it is like qualifying for a loan. There is a standard that you're looking at.
Yeah.
And what about the average cost for your services? So is it based on a percentage of what the rent payment is?
So I actually have 2 services that kind of go in tandem with each other.
Okay.
The first process is the tenant placement, and that is the equivalent of 1 month's rent. That covers the marketing, the screening, the negotiating the contract draft, and
Okay.
signing, and the move-in inspection. And then that transfers into the property management that's ongoing.
Okay.
And then I charge 8% of the monthly rent ongoing.
Okay.
So each month we deduct 8%. And that covers the 5 a.m. phone calls that the hot water tank
Yeah.
has exploded on Super Bowl Sunday. And you need to go down there and make sure that the house gets dried out and
Yes.
new and
Gets all taken care of.
yeah, so new appliance. And so that will also cover, I do 2 inspections per year minimum.
Okay.
Make sure the gutters are clean, the filters are changed, the smoke detectors have working batteries, things like that, and just to make sure that everything's in working order. I've come across houses that have wood stacked up against them, and termites are crawling up the house.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
a lot of people think it's a hands-off job once they have a tenant in there.
Sure.
That's really not the case.
Yeah, no, and you got to remember too. I mean, obviously, if you're renting something versus owning, there's not the same sense of pride of ownership. So making sure that they're taking care of the property. So what happens if the tenant stops paying their rent?
Yeah.
Are you guys stepping in and taking care of that? And is there some responsibility to you as a company for making the decision on that tenant, or how does that process work and protect the homeowner?
Correct. The one thing that I do in my leases is I make the late fees pretty steep, so it deters people from wanting to pay a little late or forget.
Okay.
If they're late the first time, I usually give them a pass and have a conversation with them about, we want to make sure that you get that on the first. It's due on the first or before, and the grace period is if there was a weekend or a holiday and
Sure.
then it got stuck in the mail. But a lot of people always think that they can just pay by the 5th, and that's not the case. If I have a tenant that has a couple of times paid late, then I, on that 6th day, will serve a 3-day pay or vacate. And,
Okay.
and I will make sure that I get in front of them and have a conversation face to face so that we can talk about, is there an issue happening? What can we do to remedy that? Because obviously moving that person out and going through any eviction is
It's
not
not a fun
preferred
process. Sure,
for
sure.
anybody. Yeah.
Okay. Are there laws in Washington or specifically in the King County market as far as in vacating and how long of a process that takes?
Yeah, it is a lengthy process because you have to file it with the courts and go through that court system, and that's what hangs it up. And meanwhile, that tenant can stay in your place and not pay rent.
Yeah.
And until they get through that eviction process, they can stay there.
So
legally.
it's really, so if you're listening and you own a rental property, I mean, we're talking about a lot of different benefits to having a property management, but I think that in itself is huge, and really having a company that is doing the screening to make sure that you're getting a good tenant in that property. What about if the tenant decides to break their lease? How does that work? Is it on an individual basis on the person that owns the property and what they want to set up for that? Do you come in with suggestions, or it's just a standard?
Yeah, I like to make it easy for everybody, and being in Seattle, it's nice if they have to break their lease. They're probably not going to have to continue to pay for the contract because we can usually get somebody in there as soon as they move out.
Okay, all right.
But otherwise, they're on the hook to pay that lease in its entirety.
So let's move over to your other hat, because you do help people, people that are looking at purchasing real estate, really focusing a lot of your business on people that are buying investment properties, correct?
Yes.
And so what is your advice right now in getting into the market for investment properties? Is there better areas that you're bringing your investors to purchase? What are you seeing?
Yeah. And it really depends on how much they want to invest and what they want their return to be. If it's a long-term goal or a short-term goal, that will really determine which properties and which areas I'm pointing to. I don't suggest investing in condos, but I have had investors insist that that's what they want to invest in. Just
and
because
what is the reason on that?
I just prefer not to deal with HOAs.
The HOAs, yes. Well, and if you're listening, I mean, the HOAs, it does have, there's a maximum amount of renters that you can have in there. And even as a person purchasing and lenders, if they're at higher qualifying, higher interest rates for condos versus single family homes, for one reason, because of the risk, and you don't have control over the homeowners association. And when you're buying in there, if somebody makes an error and an issue, it can be a disaster for resale purposes. So that makes total sense. Other disadvantages of a condo, or is it mainly the HOA?
Yeah, it's mainly the HOA and having the close proximity and living in a condo situation. The tenants, they need to be quiet tenants.
Yes.
And they also need to know they live in close proximity, so maybe
Makes
their
sense.
neighbors are not quiet. So you have to factor that in.
So a lot more to deal with in condo.
Mm-hmm.
So another, I was just thinking with property management as well as when you're trying to manage your own properties, the location has got to be a lot more carefully chosen, because you want to be in close proximity of where you live. Obviously, if you're going to be taking care of that, whereas if you hire a management company, there's really not as much limit there. So really great areas right now to purchase. What are you seeing?
I think that the lines are parallel with home purchases.
Okay.
So wherever homes are being most purchased, I see West Seattle and Ballard is very popular, Ravenna. So wherever people want to put their families is also going to be a great rental market.
Yeah.
I always say 3 bedrooms is a really good place to start.
Makes sense. So let's talk a little bit on the financing side, being that's my arena. Now, it's, the difference between a primary residence versus an investment property, if you're listening to the show right now, is down payment. There's not a lot of creativity with lower down payment options that have came back into the market yet for investment. So your standard typical lenders are going to require a minimum 20% down to get the best interest rates, 25%. And the reason for that is just because of the obvious additional risk for defaulting on that property. And when we saw the meltdown in the financial market, the people that first walked away from their homes were the investors. So you can utilize low down payment options if you plan on living in the property for at least minimum a year, and then maybe looking at turning that property around turning it into an investment property as you're building your portfolio. What are you seeing in majority of your investor buyers, Holly, on whether they're taking out mortgages for that purchase or they're paying cash for the home?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the buyer and what capital they have available. Some investors, they just want to put cash wherever they can put it, and others, they want to build more momentum. Maybe they don't want to spread themselves out thin, so they get different mortgage options for their different properties.
And we have Rose in here that I've interviewed beforehand, and I think it's really important for those of you that do have cash to pay for your property to really talk with your financial advisor.
Absolutely.
Have them run some numbers and see, because the cost of interest rates, even though you're paying a little higher rate, anywhere from 0.25% to 0.5%, depending on the down payment in investment property, that is a really, really good interest rate. Plus, you've got some tax benefits, so bringing in your CPA and really consulting with them as well. What you don't want to do is make the wrong financial decision and get your money trapped in the home if you don't have to. Now, what about cash flow? What do you advise your clients to look for in cash flow? What should they expect that makes a good financial decision in buying investment property?
Yeah, if they have cash available to purchase, then that's always beneficial, because first of all, they're going to beat out the competition. If there's people coming in to purchase a property and they've got a lender and you have cash, you're more likely to get that deal.
Yes.
But if you are using a lender, you definitely want to work with a broker who has exceptional negotiating skills, because of course you want to get the property that you're looking at.
Yes.
And so that's definitely a tactic. You got to have a great team. You got to have maintenance people. You got to have financial people. You got to have,
So just like any other purchase, you want to make sure that you have the right representation. And I know as well that if an investment purchase stacked up with primary residence, if all is all even and everything kind of is still netting out to be the same, that seller may just choose the person that's going to be owner occupying the property just because of the emotional attachment there. So there might be a little bit of a disadvantage. What other suggestions do you have for your investors out there that are purchasing?
Yeah, it's interesting what people think they want to buy and what they should buy.
Okay.
So having somebody to explain why they wouldn't want to purchase a home that they've been looking at, as opposed to a home that they weren't even considering.
Of course.
And also walking through the conversation if that deal was not accepted, and how it's not the end of the world that you didn't get that one property. There's several properties just like it.
Yeah, and a little bit different from the investor than it is the primary residence. And I think sometimes it's hard for investors to, especially a first-time person investing in real estate, that this is not an emotional purchase.
Right.
So it's completely different than your primary residence, because your preference is really what you're purchasing. So your realtor can coach you and help you in making the right financial decision as far as that actual property, but sometimes it's just a preference of what you want. When it's investment property, you want to completely take the emotional piece out of it, because it is an investment. So just like you said, having that right representation. And for you, a benefit, obviously, is you've got the experience from the realtor, licensed realtor side, and you've got the experience from the property management side to make sure that you're making the best financial decision in both of those arenas. Yes. I want to get back to cash flow really quickly here on actually the cash flow that you advise in that rental income that's coming in. Is there something kind of a cushion area, like for financing, we're going to utilize for qualifying purposes? And this is actually good to bring up for those of you that are purchasing as an investor. Qualifying, it's actually a lot easier to qualify for an investment property than it would be for a financial or for a primary residence, because the lender's going to use 75% of the market rent shown by the appraiser or the tenant that's actually in there. So you don't have to have somebody renting. They're just going to use 75%. Assuming that you're going to have a 25% vacancy factor. What are you counseling and coaching your clients to set up for a realistically vacancy factor, so that cushion there?
Yeah, and the general idea is to assume that there's going to be 2 months out of a year that you're not going to have a renter.
Okay.
And factor that in. And then, of course, having the concept of setting aside some of that income for potential maintenance and repairs. So as long as all of those things line up and you're able to maintain that property with that income, then that's something I would suggest purchasing if everything aligns.
Makes sense. Okay. Holly, any of my listeners that are thinking of getting into the investment property, the investment market, and need representation from a great realtor or somebody that currently owns rental property, and after hearing our segment has decided that it might be best to take a look at having somebody manage that, how can my listeners connect with you?
Sure. I'm always available to answer any questions. You can reach me at 206-766-8400, extension 130. You can also find tips and sign up for my newsletter at hollyfuren.com. That's HOLLYFUREN.com.
Holly, thank you so much for coming into studio. It was a pleasure having a conversation about property management with you and a little bit about the opportunities for investing in real estate. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks again to all my listeners for tuning in. This is your host and mortgage expert, Tina Mitchell, signing off for the day. I will be back same time, same place next Saturday, right here at 11:50 a.m. at KKNW. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.